Hey everyone, Pastor George here with, I actually started this late because I got really caught up in doing something fun, and we're going to talk about that at the end. But for the beginning of this, I want us to look at this stuff that I found. I did a video on this guy a few months ago, I think, and he just keeps popping back up, and I'm sick of it. I have nothing to get, I don't hate anyone or whatever, but like, I guess he's done such a good job of causing like a media sensation around him that he's popped up again and again and again. And it's just like, all right. So I have this clip that I found on Twitter, and I want to set up how we're gonna look at it by reading the Tower of Babel story from Genesis 11. So here, let me pull that up for you guys. There we go. So this is the Tower of Babel. It's from the New International Version. This famous story. I'm sure you've heard it, but it's a bear. It's where it's gonna. You're just gonna see why I chose this. So it says, now the whole world had one language and a common speech. As people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. They said to each other, come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly. They used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. Then they said, come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth. But the Lord came down to see the city and tower the people were building. The Lord said, if as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their languages so they will not understand each other. So the Lord scattered them over all the earth, and they stopped building the city. That is why it is called Babel, because where there the Lord confused the language of the whole world. From there the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth. So Babel most likely refers to Babylon, which is a pretty important city in the Hebrew Bible and in the New Testament as a image, right? This is something that's used in Revelation, Babylon, right? The whore of Babylon, all that type of stuff. I'm not going to focus too much on that, other than to say, like, what's the point of this story? And that's been interpreted a lot of different ways. I've seen everything from actually God, when he did this, confused doesn't mean like a bad thing, it means like a good thing, and so he's creating a bunch of diversity. I've seen that. I don't agree with that. I think that's a good byproduct of what happens, but I don't think that's like the point of the story. And then I've seen people, on the far other side, like maybe like Jordan Peterson, where he did like a whole Bible series on Genesis, and I remember I watched his video on Babel, and he talks about how, this is a symbolic thing against like, centralized government and planning and all that other type of stuff, and it's just some archetype that's stored in our brains. And so, I don't think that that's true either. I don't think this is the Bible commenting on central planning or government overreach or anything like that. What I do think it is it's talking about hubris, right? I don't think that when the Lord does this, it's meant to be necessarily a punishment, right, by creating diversity, but rather, again, one of these stories that's in the Bible about how humans consistently try and overreach their place, right, and that there's a very clear division between God and humanity, right. That's the whole point of the Tower of Babel, in my view. So that's all there, right? It's an interesting story. You can get really into the weeds on it, but we're not going to look at the Tower of Babel today. We're using the Tower of Babel to set up what I want to talk about and what this one guy is saying. And I'm going to be 100% honest. Until I saw this tweet, I didn't remember this guy's name. So his name is Brian Johnson, and this is he's on a podcast of some sort. You'll notice his shirt right there. It says "Don't Die" on it. So this is the guy, if you don't remember, that I did a podcast. Not a podcast. This isn't a podcast. This is like a video series, whatever. A few months ago on where he like is doing all of these crazy diets and getting transfusions and everything to like see if he can de-age himself, right? And he says it's working. I think that he's like a really really wealthy. So I think like sure, some of these things that you're doing are like very expensive health things that most wealthy people can kind of afford to do. I think the jury is very much out that none of what he's kind of proposing right now has been like largely provable or effective, right? Because the only people who are doing it are people who work for him, who have a desire or a reason to tell him it's working because they can continue to get paid, right? And I don't know. He doesn't look very human to me. That's the other thing that's kind of weird about it. But most people who use tons of products don't, and they lose that. So we're gonna, nothing against him as a person, but I think his project is really messed up. And here he is on this podcast, and he's going to be proposing Gen Zero, a post-human blank state belief and value system. So let's see what he has to say.
We're right now in a moment, like the last moment where like things kind of have been how they have been, but they're about to change radically. And in this new future, we can't predict what's going to happen. We no longer have that ability. And so we're living in a zeroth world. And so Gen Zero is a group of multi-ethnic, multinational people who rise up and they say, we are willing to courageously step into the future. And we're willing to divorce or open to divorce from ourselves all human norms, all human customs, all human thought. And we're willing to say we're wide open about everything. Absolute blank slate.
All right. So I love this. It reminds me a lot of a show I used to watch. So you can, like, I don't know a lot about Brian Johnson. I imagine that he made a lot of his money in tech. He just seems to me like one of these guys that's like from Silicon Valley. I'm going to live fact check myself. I'm happy to be wrong on this. So let me see. That can't be him, can it? This can't be him, is it? Yes, it is. Wow, look at what he used to look like. That's crazy. Oh, he grew up Mormon. Of course he did. Great. Yeah, of course he's Mormon. All right, well, anyway, it was Mormon, I guess. He left, and that makes sense as to why. Yeah, look at, yeah, he's venture capitalist. Yeah, science and technology. It seems very much like a Bay Area thing. Yeah, so this is Silicon Valley type stuff. All right, so yeah, like, so again, not surprised. The reason that you would kind of realize is it's so futurist, right? And a lot of people in Silicon Valley and in this area, like if you listen to tech CEOs or people who founded Google and Apple, and it's a vision. It's selling very much a vision as well as products, right? This idea of this kind of perfect future where we were going to live, and where tech is going to help us do all these things. Like, how many times have you seen commercials or seen company pitches where they're saying, "Oh man, look how much this is going to revolutionize everything"? And sometimes it does. Like, I'm not saying that tech doesn't revolutionize things. It absolutely does. I mean, I use an iPhone, right? I mean, the smartphone is one of the biggest technological revolutions in the world, and changed a lot of how our lives function, right? So I'm not saying that they don't do that, but also, did it completely reset society? No, right? A lot of products that are made end up getting filled in the void. I often think of like Google. When Google started out, right, their whole thing was like, I think the one rule they said is like, do no harm, or something like that. And now Google is this massive multinational company, and like helps the government in China by censoring data and things like that in China. I'm not saying there's some huge grand conspiracy, but the whole point is that a lot of these things start as big ideas, usually by like really smart college kids or people in their early 20s or in their 20s and 30s, and then it just completely gets taken over by whatever culture, because that's how things work, right? People take the technology and then they use it for their own means. You have very little control over it. Internet is a great example of this. So anyway, right? So he is proposing that, and maybe like, I don't like to psychoanalyze people, but it makes sense. Like, I never knew that he was Mormon until I looked up I know he's not anymore, but the way you're formed, the things that you're taught to believe when you're a kid impact you your whole life, right? So I don't think that it's a surprise that someone whose religion growing up said, hey, if you live a certain way, you get to become a god of your own planet, you get to become like God, would actually then be like, you know what? I can become like God in this life, right? And of course, like, the number one ways in the Bible that's identified as someone being like God is not dying, living forever, right? This is the benefit, or the temptation that the serpent gives Adam and Eve in the garden, right? So anyway, all that is aside. That's just a complete random tangent because I didn't expect to be talking about that. What he's proposing here is something called Gen Zero, where he says that it's going to be a group of, for some reason, we're at a point right now, we're at a cliff face. I guess you'd have to watch the whole podcast, so I am doing him a bit of an injustice by not doing that. But for some reason, some technological reason, we're at a cliff face and everything's going to radically change. I'll just grant him that. I don't know what he's talking about. It could be his anti-aging stuff. It could be his AI. I don't know what. So he's saying that we're at a cliff face and everything's going to change. We can't go back, and so we're at a point where we can reset, basically. And he says, well, what we need is a multicultural, multinational, or multi-ethnic, multicultural. I can't remember exactly his words. A group of people who come together and say, hey, we are completely willing to divorce ourselves from the past, right? And he says, blank slate. Now, I find that really interesting because I personally don't believe that that's actually possible. I don't believe humans are born as blank slates. This is a very common idea, right? That a lot of us hold, is that you can kind of be, you're completely morally neutral when you come into the world, and then you're kind of shaped. And I don't think that that's wrong. Like, I do think children are shaped. I think it's wrong in theory, but not in practice necessarily, right? Like, because children come into the world and we can kind of shape their beliefs and actions and things like that. However, there still seems to be ingrained somewhat morality and beliefs and things like that, right? In humans. Not like, I'm not saying that means that what he's going to argue, that we're going to be able to naturally deduce these things. I don't think we're capable of that. I just think that human beings are capable of telling others what we don't like. That's really what I mean by that. So anyway, right? So he says blank slate. And I want to talk about blank slate because really the idea of a blank slate comes from this guy, which is Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Jean-Jacques Rousseau was a French-Swiss philosopher from the Enlightenment period. And he's incredibly influential in liberalism. And what I mean by that is like the movement like away from traditionalism in Europe at the time and towards like democracy and things like that. And his whole thing was Tabula Rasa, which is blank slate. The idea that human beings are best in a natural state, right? Without things trying to tell them what to do. One of my favorite examples of this is he wrote a book about parenting, which is funny. And I'll tell you why in a little bit, but it's called Emile, and it's not even like a book that's like, I raised my kids this way, like most parenting books would be. It's a hypothetical story about raising this kid named Emile, where Emile is completely left to his own devices, and the only job of the parent or the guardian is just basically to make sure he doesn't kill himself. Everything else, like, he learns by being taught naturally. So for instance, I remember I took a philosophy of education course, so I read Emile, and I remember in Emile, like, he's basically says, like, if if they learn something's wrong when negative consequences happen to them. So for instance, like, let's say a kid takes a stone and he's in his room, Emil in this case, and he throws it to the window and it crashes the window. You don't punish him. And you don't punish him because that night he'll be in bed and the cold wind will be coming in and he'll be cold and he'll learn not to throw rocks through windows. That sort of thing, right? Now, if you're a parent and you go, well, that sounds ridiculous, it is. Jean-Jacques Rousseau is not the type of guy to be taking parenting advice from. He had lots of illegitimate children over the course of his lifetime, and he had no relationship with any of them, sent them off to live in convents, didn't visit them when they were sick and dying and things like that. Not a great guy, just personally on my list. He seems pretty morally reprehensible in a lot of ways. And grew up Calvinist. I'm Calvinist, so you could probably psychoanalyze him in a lot of ways and see how it's a rebellion, or in some ways it's a rebellion, in some ways maybe it's taking some of Calvin's beliefs to crazy extremes, not unlike Brian Johnson might do. So I'm open to it too. All right, I don't pretend. Anyway, so Rousseau, he is really important in the French Revolution, right? Because the French Revolution basically, again, is this radical thing where they go, we need to rewrite the world, and old order needs to be teared down. Even the calendar needs to go, right? So when the French Revolution happens, right, it's not just everyone remembers the guillotining of the king and queen, but so much other things in society are rewritten, right? Like things that you would think are stable, like what Brian Johnson's talking about, the calendar, right? Like most of us are just fine accepting the calendar, right? The calendar come down from us from the ancient times, right? We actually really haven't, we've changed the datings a little bit, right, when it comes to leap years and things like that, but really, like, we're using, in essence, the same calendar that the Romans and other groups were using in the ancient world, which is crazy to think about. Think about the history of that. You see it in the names, like January comes from the name Janus, right, the god of change, so new year, right? January is like the beginning of a new year. So all of that is so interesting, and I think really cool, and shows us correctly that we are attached from the past, that we can't really unattach ourselves. Even Rousseau's ideas about like what's good and bad are legacies of Christian thought about those types of things. And I imagine Brian Johnson's as well. I don't think that Brian Johnson's Gen Zero would decide, actually, you know what, or at least maybe he would, I don't know. But I doubt that they would come to the conclusion when they come together and develop a new moral philosophy that actually murder is good, right? Or that like we can get poor people to fight in arenas for us, like the Romans would do, right? They'd probably say, no, that's wrong. Well, why is it wrong? It's not evidently wrong. The Romans didn't think it was evidently wrong. So that's the problem with Tabula Rasa, is it's usually the person who's doing it always thinks they're the blank slate, and no one's blank slate, right? Because the second we come into the world, we already come into a world that's been built up around us, that we have no control over, and which pours in its morality and philosophy into our lives from the second we're born, right? And so whatever blank slate existence there may be is gone, not to mention the morality that's written on the human heart in a lot of cases. So anyway, just as examples of this, right? So they get rid of the Catholic Church in France, complete old order thing, right? So they have to get rid of that. And so the revolutionary elite, again, this is not most people on the ground. Most people on the ground are peasants and they just want food or whatever. But the revolutionary elite make new religions. So one of them is called the cult of the supreme being. And basically it's this deistic god, because they understand that at this point, even Rousseau, who is kind of like atheist, agnostic, deist type, understood that like these ideas have to be genesised somewhere, and the genesis for rights has to be found in something outside of the person, or else it can be easily dissuaded, right? This is something we've forgotten today, and I would say that's the fruit of this type of stuff. But like, so they say, well, there has to be a God somewhere out there. It's not the Catholic Church. It doesn't have to be Christianity, but it's all about reason, right? So the supreme being. So you can see that they had this festival and they literally made an idol of him. You can imagine the religious people at this time being like losing their minds, right? So anyway, this is a massive festival they had called the Festival of the Supreme Being. And here is an inscription on a church, because they would take Catholic churches and they would convert them to what this is. It says Temple of Reason and Philosophy. So they would convert them into temples of reason. And honestly, I'm not a scholar of the French Revolution, so I don't know exactly what they would, if these were just for show or if they would actually have services or something like that. So there's also called this Cult of Reason. And so all this is to say is that we have done this before, right? This thing that Brian Johnson is proposing here is something that we have done before. It's not new. It's not something that is humans have never reached precipices before where they can't predict what's going to happen. We've never been able to predict what's going to happen. So we're not living in a zero generation. I mean, maybe we are, but I don't think so. And so I think that this is mostly wishful thinking, that's saying, oh man, like so many people before, we've been like, well, no, this is our time to start something new. And you can relate this to all sorts of things, right? Even the American Revolution, right? There are some founding fathers who, when you read their work, they like think that America is going to be radically different from everywhere else, and it really doesn't pan out that way in a lot of cases. Or like the communist revolutions, right? Lots of revolutions have this type of idea, and then they get into power, and then they realize that it really isn't. There's not much that you can do about the human condition. So that's what I wanted to talk about today. Is this a modern day Tower of Babel? I mean, I don't think it's going to be that important. But hey, I thought that Brian Johnson was just going to kind of fizzle into nothing, and now he's out here getting millions of views and podcasts. So I've been wrong before. So we'll see. Maybe we'll all live to be 1,000 years old, and God will die, and we'll just become gods ourselves. But I don't think that's going to happen. All right. So next, I want to focus on a mailbag. Right? We haven't gotten a mailbag in a long time. So I want to thank the person who sent this to me, one of my friends. He was talking about, he was wondering about artifacts and archaeology and stuff that has to do with the Bible. So this is what he said. We had a conversation. So, this is what he ended on. He said the easiest way to ask this for your forum is, what are the couple, top 3 or 5, or however many suit your fancy, most significant, intriguing, just plain cool biblical artifacts that have been discovered, and what makes them so significant, etc. All right, so I love this question. This is why, I was planning to record at 7, and I didn't start until 7:40 because I was trying to decide. So he gave me 3 or 5, so I went with 4. Let me just close this tab. So this is the first one. This is the Tel Dan Stela, and this is an inscription. So stelae are these pillars of stone that you would carve things in. They were used by kings to talk about accomplishments that they did. We're going to be looking at another one in a little bit, and all of these are Old Testament, and that's largely because our archaeological history for the New Testament is fine. There's not a lot of there wasn't as much debate about the historicity or the people of the New Testament, right? Because we have references outside of the New Testament to Christians and Jesus and stuff like that. So it's not like that's ever been in debate. The only thing that I know that was in debate for a while historically was Pontius Pilate and whether or not he existed. And they did find out that he did. They found a stone. So it's called the Pilate Stone, which is really cool, but I'm not going to talk about today. So, of course, there's debate about, the miracles and things like that. But just, the bare facts of the case seem to be pretty, cut and dry from a historical perspective. Most historians, from what I know, are willing to accept, basically, that all the characters mentioned in the New Testament were real people. They're not going to be arguing that Peter, for instance, is made up. Something like that. But that is completely thrown out the window for the Old Testament. So you have to remember the Old Testament has its root in history that is thousands and thousands of years old, like thousands of years before Jesus years old, right? So there is and was a ton of debate about how much of the Old Testament narrative is actually factual, right? And there still is to this day, from a historical perspective, right? Obviously, I have my own biases, as does everyone. So I think it is factual, and so I think that these artifacts show that it is, because it shows that kind of the gaps argument that people were using against Old Testament history have gotten smaller and smaller and smaller as time has gone on. It seems to preserve historical memory very well. So anyway, the Tel Dan Stelae, right? So the Tel Dan Stelae is a stelae that is set up by Canaanite. It's in Aramaic, which is kind of the language of the time. Obviously, the Jews spoke Hebrew, but like Aramaic became their language, and this is what like Jesus was speaking. So anyway, it's in Aramaic, and you can notice that on the stone right here is this highlighted little area. I'm gonna see if I can get up to it. Yeah, you see that little thing. So that in the language says Beit David, and Beit David means the house of David in Hebrew, and that's really important because this is a reference to David as a historical character, or at least like the fact that Israelites or the kingdom of Israel saw themselves as descendants of David. Because there was debate, well, maybe David is like this King Arthur type mythological hero. It doesn't seem like that's the case, looking at the archaeological record, right? Because we began to see extra biblical evidence, like the Tel Dan Stelae, which is where it was found. I mean, I always been told that it's called the Beit David stone, but that might be the Christian bias, right? That we'd like. And I mean, it is the most important thing about it, just from a historical and religious point of view, is that it's a reference to the house of David, which is how the Hebrew Bible talks about the kings of Israel, right? So it means that the kings of Israel at the time that this was written saw themselves as being descendants of someone named David. And I don't think that would be, that there would be a reason for people outside of, if it was a mythological character, right, or some like national myth that all the Canaanite people shared, why they'd allow Israel to call themselves that. If it is that. If it's not, and it is just this historical guy that lived a long time ago, it would make archaeological and historical sense to just say, oh yeah, they're the house of David because David was their first king, or whatever. So yeah, Beit David stone, probably the not most significant, but one I think is really cool. I'm going to show the most significant one. This is part of it. Actually, there's a lot of them. This is the Psalm scroll. This is Psalm 101, I believe, from the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls are by far the most important biblical archaeological thing that we have found in a very, very long time. It was found in the 1900s, and it has this very like cool archaeological story, right? These two Arab boys. I mean, I've heard it talked about a bunch of different ways. So I don't know if the story is even true, but I'm just gonna tell you how I heard about it. So the bunch of Arab boys, are down playing, and they are throwing rocks, and they're throwing rocks into a cave, and they throw a rock into a cave, and they hear something shatter, right? And something to note is that people in this area of the world are really smart, because they know that if they find anything like this, they can sell it. So they go in and they end up finding these scrolls that have stuff written on them, and they go to the area and they begin selling them to Westerners, right? To the archaeologists who are working in the region. It's a good way to make money. Do it in Egypt as well. This is also why you have to be careful of forgeries and stuff like that. But they find, this one guy finds it, and they go to a place, and it's called Qumran, and they go there, and they go into these caves, and under lots of bat dung, they find tons and tons of scrolls. And these scrolls date to the time of Jesus. So they're, by this point, 1900 years old, probably a little before that. And they're all Old Testament books and a few extra canonical books. They come from this one sect of Judaism that's now extinct called the Essenes, which are kind of like a hermit community that lived out there. And so Now that just seems like, oh, that's not a big deal. But you have to remember, the reason this is such a big deal is because the oldest copy of the Old Testament, complete Old Testament that they had, and by this point, was from the Middle Ages. And so they had no idea, outside of conjecture, how much of the Old Testament was preserved. And so they would look back on this, and so the big thing is how much of this actually made it to our current version. You know how we'll have those conversations about, well, how do we know that the Bible today is the same Bible that was around, 1,000 years? It's been translated and retranslated, and Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, all this type of stuff, right? You'll see people talk about that. But here we found that the biblical Hebrew text that we have today is nearly, that we had in 1940, was nearly perfectly preserved. Obviously, there were things that changed, but nothing major. It's not like God became monotheistic or like something massive, right? Spelling errors or things like that happened over time. And there are sections that are missing that are now in the current Bible that you have. If you have one that's based on the critical text, which nearly all major translations are outside of the King James. So all of these, right, are now incorporated, and we were able to find out from a historical perspective how well preserved the Old Testament had been, which of course puts its dating back even further, and people have higher belief now in the ability for text to maintain clarity over centuries and even millennia, that you're not going to lose it, right? This is why we can be confident that the Iliad is actually really well preserved, even though our earliest copy of the Iliad comes from the Middle Ages. So it not only affected biblical scholarship of texts, but also scholarship of ancient texts in general. So these are incredibly cool. You can go to Israel and go to something called the Shrine of the Book, which is completely about the Dead Sea Scrolls and things like that. So very cool. Definitely the most important and consequential find in biblical archaeology ever. All right, and then we have this one. We have the Merneptah Stellae. So this is a better idea of what a stelae looked like, right? So like they were more intricate, and this little thing would have probably been part of a bigger scene, maybe pictures at the top and things like that. And this is an Egyptian stelae, which is pretty obvious if you know anything. It very much looks like Egypt, right? The pharaohs wearing the two crowns and stuff like that, and you have the gods and important stuff like that up there. And you'll notice that certain parts of this are like dirty, like they're like dirtier, right? And other parts don't. And the reason that is because this stelae is the first reference that we have extra biblically to Israel. So in these parts of this thing that are shaded off, those are people going, like archaeologists and other people making rubs, right? So they put a piece of paper on and they rub the text with chalk or with some other material, and they're able to get a copy of it and take it and study it and things like that, right? Rather than having to go look at the stone. I know this is at the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. And so like all of these little areas are references to Israel or things about it, right? That scholars have been interested in, because again, we have references to this place is Israel, and this guy Merneptah defeats them, right? So it's not like a positive whatever thing. It's just a historical thing, right? This is all about how awesome Merneptah is. So it's Egyptian propaganda or something, but still it says like, yo, I went and laid waste to Israel. So it's talking about a war that Egypt and Israel fought, and that Egyptians defeated them. This is after the Exodus. This is not about like that whole thing. This would be way later. But still, really cool. So this is another really cool one. Again, like most of this evidence, like the awesome thing about archaeological evidence is that its purpose is it helps back up narrative events that were told in sources. So we're able to tell that something like the Kingdom of Israel exists because, or at this point, the tribes of Israel, because we like have other evidence that references it. It's very helpful when you're talking about these things to have this type of stuff. So really cool stuff right here. And this one is not significant in and of itself, but incredible that we have. I mean, it is significant again because it backs up biblical narrative, which I think is kind of important historically. But the fact that we have this and existed, like the fact that it existed all this time, is crazy. So it's the Jehoiakim ration tablet. So in the Bible, right, the Israelites the kingdom of Judah is defeated and taken into exile in Babylon. But before that happens, the king of Judah is taken into exile, right? And then there's a guy who rules in his stead and tries to rebel, and the Babylonians go and they gouge out his eyes and all this other type of stuff. But Jehoiakim and his sons, the king before that guy, are taken and live in Babylon. And this stone is a ration tablet for them, right? Think about like all the things that might survive. And the thing that does survive is this stone that talks about, and these are cuneiform, that's what this is written in. This is like a Babylonian or Akkadian, I'm not quite sure. I would guess like a Babylonian language because it's in Babylon. But I can't read the German over here. Okay. I mean, I can, but I'm not going to be good at it. And so they have a stone here that talks about him getting oil and other rations, his food rations, when he lived there. And we are told in the Bible that Jehoiakim, when he lived in Babylon, was provided for by the king. And here we see that, right? And I know that might not seem like a big deal to some people, but if you actually think about it, right, a lot of what we get we're like, I think, skeptically told, well, take everything the Bible says historically with a grain of salt, right, from a secular perspective. But it really seems like the more and more digging that we do, we get a clearer picture of what Israel looked like at the time. And also, we find all these little things that just point to maybe the fidelity of the text overall. I'm not saying that from a secular perspective it wouldn't have bias or anything like that. It does. But I do think that, historically speaking, it's a really good source. And I do think that is challenging for a lot of people, and was challenging, especially for the academics in the 19th century who pretty much wrote the whole Old Testament off as a fantasy. I do think that there's a lot more in here than people are willing to admit. And I think this is really cool, right? I love archaeology, so I love all sorts of stuff. There's all sorts of other cool things. There's the Pilot Stone. There's all the foundations of the cities and stuff like that. They found the pools and the gates that are mentioned in John, the Gospel of John in Jerusalem, which is cool. I love that there's this one Babylonian stelae of the Jews, and you get to see what they looked like, or at least how they're commonly depicted, and they all kind of wear these Smurf hats, which is pretty funny. And so there's all sorts of stuff I love about biblical archaeology. But those are some of the things. Those are the top 4 things that when I decided, hey, what would I choose? I'll choose those as things that I kind of return to when I talk about this stuff, because I just think they're so interesting. All right. I hope that was all interesting stuff for you guys. I'll see you on Sunday for worship and next week with more videos. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your Thursday, and peace out.